Welcome back to Inside 2014. We are taping it at the Country Springs Hotel. We are rerunning it this morning, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you our next guest, the Governor of the state of Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker. Thanks so much for joining us.
They're a good-looking crowd and a loud crowd, too. That's pretty good. I love you, too.
You have had a remarkable, wild ride over the last couple of years, and there have been a lot of interesting things that have happened since you've been elected governor. But I had to start off by asking you, so, like, what was it like actually to be with Sesame Street puppets? Did you actually cut a spot with Sesame Street puppets?
You know, the weirdest thing about that little video is that the Muppeteers, actually talk that way even when you're not on camera. It was the most bizarre thing. So Rosita and Abby talked that way all the time. I'm sure if I'd gone home with them, they would have talked that way too.
Were there multiple takes, or even the puppets able to, you know...
We nailed it the first time, but they did a couple times just for safety. But actually, them talking that way all the time was helpful, because if anybody saw the one, my wife, actually my 6-year-old niece, more than anybody, loved the one where Rosita hugged me at the end. And I said, as weird as that sounds to hug a Muppet, because they're in character all the time, you actually felt like you knew the person you were talking to. And so at the end when she said, oh, hugs, I actually gave her a hug. And between that and borrowing my son Alex's Wisconsin hoodie, a big improvement from wearing a suit to be on Sesame Street. It was much better with a big red Wisconsin hoodie on. The national champions, soon to be, Wisconsin Badgers, right?
The other big story of the week, of course, was when the Freedom from Religion Foundation decided to demand that you remove a tweet that you, and remind me if I get, correct me if I get this wrong, that you actually tweeted, was it Philippians? Mm-hmm. Philippians 4:13.
A very common scripture.
And the Freedom from Religion Foundation said that sounded like a threat to them. And they have demanded that you remove this tweet. Are you going to remove the tweet?
No. I mean, the simple thing is, you know, for those of you who follow me on Twitter, my official one's at Gov Walker, my campaign one's at Scott Walker, but my official one, every so often, you know, a lot of times I talk about things like our blueprint for prosperity. I thank the Assembly, thank the Senate, acting on things like that. I sometimes reference stories, and whether it's in Right Wisconsin.com or other things out there, but occasionally I'll just give people insights about things I do. And so Saturday morning, for example, I went and got a haircut over at the mall, Mayfair, and saw some walkers and mentioned that, not walkers in the family, but literally Paul walkers. And then the next day, my devotional I have called Jesus Calling just happened to be that devotional, and I liked it, so I tweeted it. And hopefully inspired a few people as well.
Okay, now that's it for the easy questions. Now,
you don't think Rosita and my tweets
we could spend the whole half hour on that. I think the public listeners would, you know, we could also talk about Hank the dog, but, you know...
Yeah, and the brackets, then I'd be all set there, right?
I think Hank the dog is going to come up during the segment we call What I Don't Get Is. I'm really hoping to get a Hank the dog question. Now, we spent the last few years, and you have been here every year, I think since we began the Inside program, and we spent the last couple of years talking about what you have accomplished with Act 10 and the controversies about Act 10. I want to turn this around just a little bit. I'd like to look forward. You're running for re-election, in theory. What would a second, or was it be a third, Scott Walker term? What would be different in a third Scott Walker term? Don't tell me what you've accomplished so far. What would you accomplish in the next 4 years?
Even bigger?
Yes.
Tax reform. I think it's not enough just to keep chipping away taxes. We've cut, well, I can't say what we've cut because you threw that off the table, but we'll come back to talking about it. But I think we've cut taxes every year we've been in office. I'd like to not only continue that for the next 4 years, by 2018, for example, I believe that property taxes in this state can be lower in 2018 than they will be in December of 2014, which means they'll actually be lower than they were in December of 2010. I think that's a remarkable thing. Let me give you an example of why that's important. It's not just because tax relief is popular, obviously by your response, property tax relief is popular, but I think it's more important. I think for those of us as conservatives, as Republicans, we need to offer something more. We need to offer an optimistic vision, both for our state and for others running for federal office for our country. And to me, one of the biggest things you can do to help people live, we should be great defenders of the American dream. And one of the best things you can do is help people have a better opportunity to live the American dream. And for a lot of people, particularly young families just starting out, what's one of the big steps in living the American dream is owning your own home. And up until now, what's been one of the biggest barriers has been high property taxes that price a new starter home out of the market of a lot of people out there. I want to be at a point where 4 years from now, it's cheaper to buy a home when it comes to property taxes than it is right now, that people can afford to do that. And overall, that it's less expensive if you're a retiree, it's less expensive if you're a working person in the state, it's less expensive overall. And I think tax relief, I'll give you one other example of that. We've done a lot already, but I think continuing to put more money back in the hands of the hardworking taxpayers will not only pay off in terms of being popular, but I think it'll pay off in terms of the economy. And I apply what I call the Kohl's standard. Kohl's, the department store. But my wife years ago, when we were after we were first married, told me I couldn't shop there again because I bought something on retail without buying it marked down, right? And so I learned a long time ago that you can get, 30 or 20 or 15% off, plus your Kohl's cash on top of that, plus a whole bunch of other stuff. So you're almost at the point where they're paying you to buy things. Well, why does that work? Because they sell more volume. They could make more per product, but in the end, they lower the prices, broaden the number of people who purchase things there, and what does that do? That increases their profit. I apply the same standard to the taxpayer. If we lower tax rates on property taxes, on income taxes, on business taxes in the state, we put more money back in the hands of the consumers and employers of the state. It's what Art Laffer once was referenced to as the Laffer curve. We're going to see more people working and making more money and having more jobs and more people hiring and more employers growing. And we're going to have more money to put right back into tax relief and education reform and all the other things we want to do in the next 4 years and beyond.
Okay. I want to ask you about something that's happening right now. We have actually a lot of state legislators over here, a lot of members of the state assembly in the room here. Tomorrow they are going to, I think it's their last day of their session, and they're going to take up a number of bills, including the final passage of a bill that will standardize the hours for early in-person absentee voting. Because, of course, right now we have a situation where in some cities they will vote on weekends where most of the state is not able to vote. It certainly appears that that bill, which passed the Senate, is also going to pass the Assembly. But you have not yet said whether you support that legislation, do you?
Well, look at it. In general, my premise is I want to make it easy to vote but hard to cheat. And the reason I say that is because I want people who are legitimate to be able to vote in the state, no matter whether they live in a city or a small town or anywhere else in between. So I get the concerns, but I also want to balance it, making sure I continue to make it easy for people to vote in the state. What I do think, and I think you mentioned the Assembly, I'd like to make sure the Senate brings up a measure the Assembly already passed, because I think we can make a modification to the state voter ID law that would empower us to go forward with a law that will be upheld in both the federal and the state courts. Because to me, much more important than anything else we're talking about elections is making sure that we not only make it easy to vote, but harder to cheat, or hard to cheat at all. And we need to have a voter ID law. We had it 3 years ago when I signed it into law, when the Assembly and Senate joined with us. It worked that first election in February of 2011. The courts have tied it up since. I'm not a lawyer, but the ones that followed this in the courts at both the federal and state level tell me we need to make some adjustments to be in a position to have it upheld at the state and at the federal level. And I think what the Assembly has already passed is something the Senate could bring up quite quickly before they adjourn for the session, and we'd be in good shape. Because to me, that's the bottom line. I want voter ID as we go into future elections.
Okay, so your formulation though was you want to make it easier to vote but harder to cheat. Obviously, we know where the voter ID falls in that. That sounds like you are leaning against the bill that would restrict the early voting hours. Are you considering the possibility of vetoing something passed by a Republican legislature?
We'll look at all of that. I mean, there's a balance. I mean, I was looking up the other day, I'm up in Green Bay and Appleton a lot. The Appleton city clerk raised some concerns there, for example, about the fact that they actually think it'll cost them more money because they have so many people that want to vote absentee. There's some concerns about, whether or not they'd have to bring in overtime. There's other issues out there. I get the reasons that are out there. I think there are good, legitimate reasons why the measure was passed. But I also think there's some counterbalances to that in the sense that I'd like to see uniformity, but I don't know that giving up on weekend voting, if people, again, if they're legitimate, if you saw the story the Wisconsin State Journal ran yesterday, there's just as many people voting early in Republican areas of the state as there are Democrats. So it statistically really isn't proven that it's an advantage one way or the other. But what I want to make sure is going ahead in future elections, we don't have people in a position of cheating. And we've seen it time and time again. It may not be in massive numbers, but if there's just one instance or more where people are not having to provide photo ID and therefore cheating the system, that's a vote that's taken away from at least one person in this room, and any of us could be in that position. So I think it's really imperative, for all the hype and hysteria that some of the others in the media have had about the other measures, the most important thing we need to do when it comes to elections is tighten up voter ID.
The other big piece of legislation, very controversial piece of legislation, involves a mandate of insurance companies, the way that they deal with a certain cancer drug, the oral chemotherapy. That was passed by the state senate after a great deal of controversy. You have said that you would sign that. So if the assembly, including the people who are here tonight, if they amend that bill and they include some cost controls or some cost sharing, and that is approved by the Senate, will you sign that bill as well?
Sure.
Will you sign anything that comes out of the state legislature?
Correct.
What was, so far this year, the most important piece of legislation that you signed, you think, in 2014?
Oh, this year, I think for sure, our Blueprint for Prosperity, which the Assembly just concluded on Tuesday. Remember, this is a good example where I said, don't take the bait. A lot of the other folks in the media tried to goad the Assembly and the Senate and us to all get in a big fight, when in the end, we tweaked our original measure a little bit. The Assembly went up front and passed it in the original form. We tweaked it a little bit with the Senate. We still got $500,000 worth of property and income tax relief. So much so, as like I said, property tax is going to be down by $100 this year in a typical home. They're going to be lower in 2014 than they were in December 2010. Think about that for a minute. If I had told you 4 years ago as a candidate, property taxes in a typical home would be lower at the end of my term than they were before I started, even some of my most ardent supporters who would have said, I don't know, that's pushing it, Scott. That just can't happen. Yet that's what the Assembly passed the other day, the Senate passed the week before, and I'm going to sign next week. On top of that, with that surplus starting April 1st, no fooling, on April 1st, we're going to start withholding reform changes, which, for those who don't know, maybe listening say, what's withholding? It's the money the federal and the state government take out of our paychecks at a higher amount than we actually owe to the federal and state government, earn interest on it, and then give it back to us the next year in April without the interest, claiming some of that a refund. We're going to change that because we reformed income taxes in the state. So for a typical working family in the state, mom and dad work 2 kids, they're going to get an extra $522 back in their paycheck yet this year. To me, that Blueprint for Prosperity is the recipe for greater prosperity going forward.
All right, let's do a very quick break. We will be back. We will be back in just a couple of minutes with the governor of the state of Wisconsin, Scott Walker. You're listening to Inside 2014. I'm Charlie Sykes. And this is where we do. Okay, so you can just crank me up again? Yeah. Welcome back to Inside 2014. I'm Charlie Sykes. Joining me live in this segment, the governor of the state of Wisconsin, Scott Walker. Now, Governor Walker, I actually mentioned this at an event we were at last Friday, right? Here at Waukesha, where you devoted an entire section of your book to explaining why you had ignored some advice from me. Because I had suggested at a certain point during the protest that you'd go Chris Christie. And you explained why that wasn't your style, that you were not Chris Christie. I'm guessing you're feeling a lot better about that decision these days.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Well, and just so people know, and you and I are on the same wavelength more times than not by far, but it was involving an incident where, and some of the lawmakers here remember this, where we had all sorts of amazingly outrageous protests in and around the Capitol, but one in particular I think took the cake. It was where we were outside. For years I've been involved with the Special Olympics in something called the Law Enforcement Torch Run, where I've been out here in Waukesha and in Pewaukee County, where we would run the torch with athletes from the Special Olympics. Well, this particular day we were outside around the Capitol on the square. Some other speakers were speaking before, and right before I got up, a bunch of protesters who'd been in the Capitol dressed as zombies. Remember that?
Yeah, it was
as zombies.
Classy moment.
Came out and got in between me and the Special Olympic athletes. And for a moment, I thought about calling him out, and that's where afterwards we were kind of kidding me, saying you should have gone Chris Christie. And I said, I'm not Chris, and this is not New Jersey. But in the end, the benefit was the focus. I think it was MacGyver Institute, some others did some video. And the world got to see that the issue was between the protesters and the Special Olympic athletes, not between the protesters and me.
And that really was a turning point. So I want to look ahead a little bit. Now, eventually you're going to be asked this question by somebody, so you might as well ask it right now. If you are reelected this November, will you pledge to fill out your full 4-year term?
Well, I've never done that in the past. When I was in the Assembly, when I was county executive, I've never committed. See, to me, I think there's a difference. You're going to see in this race, one of the candidates is going to tell you how long she wants the job. I'm going to tell you what I plan on doing when I'm in the job. She's promised to make no promises other than to tell you she'll serve for 4 years and take the job for 4 years. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you that we're going to lower property taxes in 2018 from where they are in 2014. I'm going to tell people what I'm going to do with other issues between now and November 4th. And I think if you're hiring somebody, I got to think if there's any small business owners here, when you hire somebody, you don't want to know, are you going to work the next 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 years? You want to know, what are you going to do? What are you going to produce? How do I measure it?
Since you mentioned that candidate, were you at all surprised that Mary Burke yesterday came out against the expansion of school choice, that she reversed her position and said that she would repeal the expansion of school choice and would repeal the deduction for the tuition deduction for parents of children in private school? Were you surprised by that decision?
I was, because you remember earlier in the campaign, apparently the focus groups at that time were implying that she needed to be more of a centrist, and so she talked about having at least some interest in school choice, of not pulling it back but not adding to it. It was similar to other issues out there. Somewhere along the line, I have to assume that some people cynically on her side said, your base is not with you, and so you need to start taking more liberal and more liberal and more liberal positions on this and other issues out there. But I think it's outrageous. You know, both my kids, one of my sons is here tonight, looking pretty dapper in his suit over there. Both Matthew and Alex are both in college now, one at Marquette, one at Wisconsin. But both of them went through public schools in Wauwatosa. Both my nieces go to public schools. I went to great public schools. In fact, what we did in Act 10 is probably one of the most dynamically positive things we could do for public education in the last 25 or 30 years. But having said that, my goal overall is not to have a great public school system, it's to have a great educational opportunity for every family, for every son and daughter in this state. And that means for most, it's going to be at a traditional public school. For some, it's going to be at a charter school. For others, it's going to be at a private school, some with a voucher, some with that tuition tax deduction, and others, it's going to be at a homeschool environment. And you know what? Every one of those should work. And I mentioned Matt and Alex for a second, but think about it. None of you flinched when I said I've got a son at Marquette and a son at Wisconsin. One's at a public school, one's at a private school. Why? Because when it comes to higher education, routinely we go out and we work with our kids to find our sons or daughters the best school that fits their needs for their career path and what they're interested in. Why is it so unusual that we might offer the same opportunities to get the best possible education, be it public or private or otherwise, when it comes to K-12 education?
Governor Scott Walker, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it. As you do every year with the Inside program. Appreciate it very much. You've been listening to Governor Scott Walker in our segment Inside 2014. I'm Charlie Sykes. We'll be right back.